just as good the first service too. If you'd like to follow along in your bulletin, our scripture reading comes out of Luke's Gospel, chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. When I was little, growing up, the nativity scene was my responsibility to put up because I like to play with the nativity set. And my dad made this thing here, the manger, the nativity set, and he took he put lofts in it, and the twigs, which are holding up the lofts, came from our walnut tree, which was in our backyard. And so whenever we would set up the nativity set, I would always set it up in the most conspicuous place in our house, which was on the Zenith Magnavox in the living room. Okay, that's not the TV that we have, but one very, very similar to it. And so how many of you remember doing that, putting your nativity set on the television? And so that was in the middle of the thing. And at our house, we also had bookshelves that went from the floor to the ceiling and filled up the whole room. And so I would set up this nativity set, and this is that nativity set. When my father passed away a couple years ago, I got it. And so it has all the requisite pieces. It has 3 kings, and it's got Mary and Joseph, and it's got a shepherd and some of those things, and had sheep. And these original pieces, by the way, are made out of paper mache instead of being made out of other things. And so I would play with the nativity set, and every year, Woolworths, do you guys remember Woolworths? We had a Woolworths in Nebraska City, and it's a 5 and dime store, kind of like Ben Franklin or whatever, and they would have a little bin by the cash register which had figurines for your nativity set. And so every year, my mom would let me buy more things, and so we ended up having an entire herd of camels, and we had a whole flock of sheep, and we added other shepherds, and so we got this guy, got some strange guy playing a flute, don't quite know what he would be doing, but he's, putting with the shepherds. Have a beggar. Now, this morning I had the beggar over here, but I thought, he's not going to get any money with the shepherds, so I put him over here with the kings, where the offering should be a little bit better. And I had an old McDonald's play set, and so I put chickens and ducks in the loft, and I even had a fat red pig, but not realizing, of course, that in a Jewish setting, a pig would not be welcome in the manger. And I would every day, or not every day, but several times, I would move everything around. Some days the kings would be courtside and the shepherds would be off in the cheap seats, and then other days I'd bring the shepherds up to the good seats and put the kings off in the nosebleed section and would, play with them, and the shepherds would be making the trip through the bookshelves and, just a good time. Well, my granddaughter evidently came by this idea of playing with nativity sets naturally. And so she started playing with our nativity sets, and I collect them. I've got, I don't know how many we got, 15, 20 of them, more than we can count. And Linda made me a couple of ceramic ones, and so she made this ceramic one, which was sitting on a table beside the television. And Dawson, who was our youngest grandchild at the time, had been over at the house, and I noticed that something was different about the nativity set. And so I went up and I looked at it, and on closer inspection, I found that she had added 4 of the dwarfs from a Happy Meals Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs collection. And so if you come up and you look at mine, you will find that I have now added the 7 Dwarfs and Snow White to our manger set. She had, I thought it was clever because she had Dopey and Doc with the 3 wise men. And Makes sense, right? And Sneezy was keeping his hygienic distance from the baby Jesus, and Grumpy was up by the manger scowling at Jesus. Here's the first lesson I want us to get from today, though, is that when Dawson added those figures to the nativity set, she was making a theological statement. She didn't realize it, but she was. Human beings, our best effort to reach God has always been through our own efforts. We go to church, we give money, we do works, trying to earn God's favor, trying to earn God's grace. And it doesn't work. We can never earn God's grace. We can never be good enough, which is the message of Christmas. Is it because we could never reach God, God came down to us in the form of himself being born in our world as a little baby. God, who is so big, who created everything, that we would never be able to comprehend that, became so small that he could be held on Mary's lap, that he could be enwrapped by her arms, so that anybody and everybody can come to know who God is. Anybody and everybody is welcome to come to the nativity, to the birth of Jesus, from the rich kings to the poor shepherds to the dwarfs. How many of you identify with being grumpy or sleepy or sneezy? Each and every one of us is invited to come to the manger. That's the first thing I want you to, that should get an amen, right? I mean, each and every one of us can come to the manger. Second thing, though, is where did this all happen? It happened in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is a small town. Now, I grew up in what I thought was a small town, Nebraska City, 7,000. It's one of the largest towns in Nebraska. You know, it's I played in the second largest classification of schools, the equivalent of your 4A or 5A schools. But you know how you know when you live in a small town? You live in a small town when the biggest building is the grain elevator. You know you live in a small town when the post office is only 3 blocks away, but it takes you an hour and a half to get your mail because you have to stop and talk with everybody that you meet on the street and to gossip in the post office. You know you live in a small town when the largest employer is a school, provided you still have a school in your town. You know you live in a small town when you dial a wrong number and you still talk to that person for 40 minutes anyway because you didn't see them at the post office. So you have to get them all caught up to the things. You know you live in a small town if there are elderly people in your community who have a restricted driver's license, which means they can only drive in town because everybody else knows who they are and you get out of their way. How many of you live in a small town? You know, Benton is a small town, but it really doesn't count because it's a bedroom community of Wichita. You know, it's not so isolated, but small towns. Now, there was a guy I read in Sports Illustrated one time about this athlete who grew up in Texas, and he said that he came from a small town in Texas, 50,000 people. That's not a small town. In Nebraska, there's only 2 towns bigger than that, Lincoln and Omaha. And on Saturdays, 6 times, 7 times a year, this is the 3rd largest city in Nebraska. 90,000 people crowd into that. When I think of a small town, I think of the first place that I served as a pastor, which is in Linda's hometown, Harrison, Nebraska. 300 people. It's 15 miles away from the Wyoming border, or the South Dakota border, and 9 miles away from the Wyoming border, clear up in the northwest corner. The first year that I was there, one fall morning, cold, crisp fall morning, which means it was like early September, that I heard 2 calves bawling in my backyard. And I looked out the front window, and here was a cowboy on his horse looking for the calves because there was a cattle drive going right down Main Street. And they still do this today. They move their cattle from the pastures, the winter pastures on the north side of town. They drive them right down Main Street, right past the Sioux County Bank and right past the lawyer's office, right down Main Street to the pastures on the south side of of town. Harrison was the only place I ever lived when you had to watch out for cow pies walking down to the post office on the sidewalk. But you do cattle drives in western Kansas still that go right down the highways and go right down the street. That's what I think of when I think of small towns. When Linda was in Harrison, her graduating class was the largest graduating class they had, 28 people. Our one daughter graduated from Harrison, and her class was what, 8? 9. They had a class of 9. They played 6-man football. Oh, she's just telling me they didn't even get to complete the season this year. They ran out of football players. They only had 5. But again, you know you live in a small town when the rodeo arena has lights and the football field doesn't. You know? Well, Bethlehem was a small town. In Jesus' day, the population of Bethlehem was probably 300 or less. It just barely existed. The name Bethlehem literally means house of bread. Beth means house, Lehem means bread. It was a farming community. It was a sheep-keeping community. But nonetheless, Bethlehem was a famous place. And it was famous for several reasons. The first one is that when Jacob, with his many wives, he had 4 wives, and he had 11 sons, and he had a daughter. They were making their way, down to where they were going to live. And Rachel, his favorite wife, was giving birth to their 12th son, and she died during childbirth. And her last breath, as she named her son Ben-Omai, which means son of my sorrow. How would you like to go through life with a name like that? Ben-Omai. It would always remind you that your mother died giving birth to you. And so his father Jacob says, no, we're not going to name him Ben-Omai. We're going to name him Benjamin, which means son of the south or son of my strength. And so Rachel died, and she was buried. Her tomb is in this little place, which is on the outskirts of Bethlehem. Bethlehem was also the hometown of Naomi. Naomi was married, and she had 2 sons, and there was a drought in Bethlehem, and so they moved to Moab, which is on the other side of the Dead Sea, and they were living there, and the 2 boys each married. They each took a wife. One's wife was named Ruth, and the other wife's name was Orpha. Now, here's a throwaway line for you, is that Oprah Winfrey, her mother was naming her for Orpha, but she read it wrong. So it became Oprah. She transposed it. She's dyslexic, I guess, or something. But anyway, so that's who these 2 girls were. And her sons and her husband, they all died. And so here's Naomi, who is now destitute. She tells her 2 daughters-in-laws to go back to their hometowns because she's not going to be able to provide for them or provide husbands for them. And so Orpha, she leaves. But Ruth says to Naomi, she says, I won't leave you. He says, your people will be my people. I'll live where you live. Your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go. And so they return to Bethlehem. And so now they're there. And Naomi realizes that they need to have some sort of an income, and she needs to do something. And so she tells Ruth that you should go glean in a field. And so we see God's intervention, and that Ruth is gleaning in a field which is actually owned by one of their distant relatives. To shorten the story up, it's a wonderful love story. To shorten it up is that Obed, or Boaz, and Ruth fall in love. And Boaz makes arrangements to marry Ruth through the Levirate marriage laws in order that he can now provide for Ruth, but also to provide for Naomi. And they get married. And then they eventually have a boy whose name is Obed. And Obed eventually gives birth to another boy by the name of Jesse. And Jesse will give birth to a boy by the name of David, who will fight a giant by the name of Goliath, and then will become the king of Israel. David's hometown was Bethlehem. And Jesus is of the line of David. It's not a coincidence that Jesus was born in the city of David, Bethlehem. Matthew and Luke go to great lengths to give us the genealogy of Jesus so that we know that he was born in Bethlehem of the line of David. And how cool is it that Jesus, who said that he was the bread of life, was born in a city, the town of Bethlehem, which means house of bread. That Jesus, who was born of the line of David, the shepherd who became king, says that he is the good shepherd and is the king of his people. He is the good shepherd. Now, how many of you ever had your parents say this to you? Were you born in a barn? If you made a mess, if you spilt something, if I would spill something, my dad would get, he wouldn't get mad at me, but he would get frustrated. And he would say, where what? What is this? Were you born in a barn? Now, there was a wrong answer to that. The wrong answer was to say anything. The right answer was to go get the paper towels and start cleaning up the mess. Because, no, I wasn't born in a barn. But guess who was? Jesus. Jesus was born in the barn. If he ever made a mess and Joseph says to him, were you born in a barn? Jesus could actually say, yes, I was. As a matter of fact, I was born in a barn. Well, he was born technically in a cave. We usually, when we think of Jesus, because there was no room in the inn, when we think of an inn and that he was born, put in a stable, we think of something like this, this wooden-shaped thing, like being like a barn. But in all likelihood, Jesus was born in a cave. Now, there was a guy by the name of Justin Martyr in 155 A.D., in a letter that he wrote called the Dialogue with Trypho, he reports that Jesus was born in a cave just outside of Bethlehem. And then another guy by the name of Origen of Alexandria in 247 A.D. reports the same thing, that Jesus was born in a cave outside of Bethlehem. The point is that Jesus probably was born in a cave. Now, when we hear the story that there was no room in the inn, we usually think that the innkeeper was green and that his heart was 3 sizes too small. We think that he was the Grinch, that if he really would have known, when Mary and Joseph came to his house, that he would have given them their own room. And when we think of an inn, how many of you immediately think of Holiday Inn or Motel 6? And so the picture we have is here's Mary and Joseph, and they show up on their donkey. Vroom vroom's got his donkey, and he starts knocking on the doors of the various Holiday Inns, and they all have no vacancy signs. And they're bummed out because there's no place, because Mary's going to have her baby. And so then finally they knock on this last inn, and the guy says, I don't have room in your inn, in my inn, but tell you what I do have a garage in the back, and you can have the garage. And so he puts Mary and Joseph back there, and we think, that's harsh. In those days, an inn was a small house, one room house. There would be a common table, and everybody would eat at the table. And then when they got ready to go to sleep, they would push the table and the chairs off to the side, and everybody sleeps together on the floor. How does that sound? You want to pay $99 a night at a Hotel 6 to do that? Everybody sleep together in one room in the lobby? That's what an inn was. Now, if you're Mary and you're going to have a baby any minute now, do you want to deliver your baby in an audience? Of course not. What does she want most of all? Privacy. And so the innkeeper gives her what she most needs and desires. Privacy. He would have got rid of the animals, put down clean straw, and put them in the cave, which served as the stable for the animals, that was either beside or under the inn. When you go to Jerusalem today, when you go to Israel today, you can go to the Shepherd's Field, which is just outside of Bethlehem. The picture on the top left is the houses that you see on the very top left. That's the outskirts of modern-day Bethlehem. And in between where I'm standing on this rock and that pasture there is the shepherd's pasture, the shepherd's field. And I am standing above the cave complex that you see on the picture that's on the lower right. Bethlehem and this area is riddled with caves. They're everywhere. And so when Justin Martyr says that Jesus was born in a cave outside of Bethlehem, he's right. When the angels said to the shepherds, "Today, this day is born to you in the city of David Christ the Lord," how would the shepherds know where the cave was? Because they're everywhere. They had used these caves for shelter for themselves and for their sheep. And so when he says, when the angel identifies where it's at, they knew where to go. They knew where these caves were. And so when you go to modern day Bethlehem, there's the Church of the Nativity, which would have been on the outskirts of Bethlehem. Today it's in the middle of Bethlehem because it's a lot bigger. And on the top right, you see that's what the church looks like from the outside. When you go inside the church, that's what the inside of the church looks like. But underneath, in the front of this church, there is a cave. And you go down these steps and you go through this little narrow entry. And when you get inside of it, you are in this grotto or in this cave. And the ceiling is black now from all of the candles that have been burning in there for the centuries. And that's looking towards the back of the cave. And just to the left, when you're looking towards the front of the cave, there is a little niche in the wall of the cave, which is where the manger was. And they mark it now with this silver star. And that's where Jesus was born. And so when you go and you tour the Holy Lands, this is between 95 to 99% probability that this is where Jesus actually was physically born. God came in the flesh to be with us. So what are some of the implications to this? The first one is that God chose a small town for Jesus' birth. He didn't choose the big city. He chose the small town. Don't you just love small towns? I do. Wonderful things happen in small towns. Secondly, is God became small so that we could know him. He became small so that we could wrap our mind around what it is that he was doing for us. We don't have to be from the big city or be important to meet Jesus. You don't have to be one of the kings. You don't have to be one of the shepherds. You can even be one of the dwarfs. Anybody and everybody is welcome and is invited. For unto you, unto us, in the city of David, is born Christ the Lord. Don't you just love small towns? Let us pray.